Salutations, respected viewers. This is George from Ireland, speaking to you from an undisclosed location. I shall be continuing my series about the Irish oppression myth, looking back at the 18th century again a little, and then on into the 19th century. People often talk about 800 years of conflict, which of course is drivel, because the 800 years when most of Ireland was connected to Great Britain was a time of internal peace. Yes, there were conflicts from time to time. There were rebellions, but they weren't always separatist rebellions. There were many rebellions in England, Wales and Scotland, sometimes more rebellions over there than in Ireland. For instance, the 16th century, many rebellions in England. But I'll come back to that. So I previously alluded to an act to prevent the further growth of popery, passed in 1704 by our Parliament in Dublin. And it was certainly discriminatory. Every country in the world discriminated against those who were not part of the official religious denomination, which is not a tu quoque argument. It's not good. It's still unacceptable. That was the way the world worked back then. The notion of religious equality didn't exist. What people believed was very much considered the government's business, and the government wished to encourage what it considered to be the right creed and discourage what it regarded as being the wrong creed, to pressurize people into becoming Protestants. That's to say, members of the Church of Ireland. That was the state religion. Bear in mind that dissenters were also penalized. By dissenters, I mean Protestants outside the Church of England, people who were Presbyterians, Baptists, and so forth. And priests, Catholic priests, had to get permission to come into Ireland. Not much of this was given out. So that doesn't mean that Catholic priests were banned. Just not many of them were allowed, because the Catholic clergy were often correctly regarded as recruiting sergeants for the Jacobite cause. Remember, the King of Ireland was the same person who was the King of Great Britain, but the legitimate line were the Jacobites, as in James II's descendants. And when James II's descendants, Bonnie Prince Charlie and his father, the Old Pretender, when they had decided to try and reclaim their thrones of Great Britain and Ireland, they had landed in Great Britain, not in Ireland. This was a Catholic dynasty, and one of the reasons they didn't get very far in Scotland and England is most people over there were Protestant. So despite us being mostly Catholic, 75% or more, they didn't come to Ireland because they were content, realised it was not the fertile ground for an insurrection. And being cut off by sea from Great Britain, they would have had a better chance in military terms. But again, they saw that we were not restive. Let me see. So what was going on in Ireland was the religious minority, who had most of the wealth and the guns, discriminating against the majority. So we mustn't blame Great Britain for this 300 years later. And everybody in Ireland, just about, has a descendant from Great Britain. I realise they're new Irish people. They're Irish Romanians, Chinese Irish people, Nigerian Irish people, who become citizens of the Irish Republic or of the UK if they live in the north. And they have as much right to be in Ireland as I do. I completely accept that. But apart from that very small minority, almost all of us have ancestors from our eastern neighbour. Now, what's the next thing I was going to point out? Okay, so mass rocks. Well, we know the Church of Ireland was established in the 1530s, a carbon copy of the Church of England, and they took over all the ecclesiastical buildings. And unfortunately, Henry VIII, who was King of Ireland from 1543, he'd imposed his dissolution of the monasteries in Ireland in the 1530s as well. So the religious houses, the monks and the nuns, turned out of their abbeys, convents, monasteries, what else would you say, priories, and these were torn down, which is an awful shame. But it showed how royal authority worked even on the west coast of Ireland. I've seen in Sligo, a former Franciscan monastery, that was razed at the time. So the Church of Ireland had these places of worship. The Catholic Church got some of them back in the 17th century, particularly in the 1640s, when the Protestant immigrants were driven out of large parts of Ulster. But then the Church of Ireland largely came back. So people were hearing mass at mass rocks, because often we didn't have church buildings, the Catholic majority. And occasionally these people, the priests, were caught and punished, even killed occasionally, which of course monstrous. Nobody should be killed for his faith. That was the way it worked in the 17th century again. This is largely one group of Irish people doing it to another. Though I admit there was a significant English community in Ireland in the 17th century, sometimes calling themselves English and consider themselves to be English. So yeah, English people can sometimes be blamed for this. But the idea that 80% of people heard Mass on a Sunday and the other 20% of people didn't know where they were is obviously specious. So Catholic worship did carry on, and I know there were hedge schools and so on, which is often due to penury rather than not being permitted to go to school. And Trinity College Dublin, the only university in Ireland, that was open to Catholic undergraduates in the late 18th century. The Catholic Church didn't like us going there because it wanted us to be educated according to their mores. There was no Catholic university in Ireland. We'd have to go to France in particular. And almost everyone who went for tertiary education in the Catholic world was becoming a priest, even if he practiced another profession such as law. Let me see. So, yeah, there's a lot of focus on the wrongdoing by members of the Crown Forces, and indeed some of them did do wrong, no question about that, deliberately killed civilians. So I'm fair-minded enough to mention these things even when they tend to go against the case I'm seeking to make. Obviously, in Ireland, if we're nationalists, we tend not to talk about, in the 1640s, massacres of Protestant civilians in Portadown and so on, and then Catholic civilians were murdered as well by anti-Catholics. That's the thing is, I suppose, rather than saying people are Protestants and they're committing these crimes, we could call them anti-Catholics, or rather than saying someone's a Catholic and he's killing a Protestant, we could say he's an anti-Protestant, something like that. I don't wish to be seen to be demonizing whole communities. Right, so I've already talked about the famine and the ghastly suffering that entailed, but let's move on. I talked about Easter Rising a little bit and the posthumous conscription of dead Republicans into the ranks of the most obdurate Republicans these days. So yeah, I alluded to this previously. There is this gigantic misconception that insurrections in Ireland were always nationalistic in motivation. They somewhat were. Now, when Hugh O'Neill rebelled in the late 16th century, there was talk of making him King of Ireland. Of course, we were claimed by Spain at the time. Philip II of Spain had previously been married to Mary Tudor, who was Queen of Ireland. And he'd claimed that title for himself. He had indeed been granted it when he married her. And his troops landed on the west coast of Ireland in 1588 when the Spanish Armada failed. But they were all massacred, including at Smerwick in Kerry. Fascinatingly, along with the Spanish army were some papal troops. Remember, the Pope had an army back then, not the Swiss Guard, not 50 soldiers. It was a serious military force of tens of thousands of men. So despite Kerry being the most distinctly Catholic area of Ireland, the Pope's troops were put to the sword by the local people. So it shows fanatical loyalty to our monarch, Elizabeth I, she was. Next thing, again, why did Philip II not land in Ireland? As most of us were Catholics, would he not have been assured of a warm welcome? Well, no, that's not the case. A lot of people are capable of double think. So I'm a Catholic, I obey the Pope, but then sometimes disobey him, like when the Catholic Church excoriated Republican terrorists. Someone would still say, no, I'm a Republican and I'm a fervent Catholic, and see no contradiction between being an IRA man and going directly against the doctrine of the Catholic Church. So you'll see that again and again. And the Pope was a political leader, still is to some extent, and so he claimed the right to distribute land, say who was the rightful monarch here and there. Doesn't seem quite right to me. But anyway, so we could see why rebellions happened. Often they were unpopular policies, unpopular governors, excessive taxation. In 1641, the Confederation of Kilkenny, which was a Catholic organisation, fervently proclaimed its loyalty to our King, Charles I, and attacked the Protestant settlers in Ireland, who were mostly for Parliament. The English Civil War was about to kick off between Parliament and the monarch. I know it's called English Civil War, but it was fought in Ireland as well. So these so-called rebels were monarchists, but they're claimed as spiritual forefathers by the Republican movement of present times. Nothing could be further from the truth. They weren't rebels, they were loyalists. But they're not loyalists in the modern sense. So it's a total inversion of reality. We could look at the first and second Desmond rebellions, which were about anti-Protestantism, xenophobia, and opposition to the policies of Elizabeth I. But even if they'd been successful, we would not have broken with England in the late 16th century. We would have been more united. Because imagine if the Reformation in England hadn't happened. Most of us were Catholic, the English were Catholic, the Welsh too, possibly the Scots. Then we would have something crucial in common, because the Irish language seems not to be the key marker of this distinct national identity. Daniel O'Connell said the chief distinction between Irishmen and Englishmen is that Irishmen are Catholic and Englishmen are not. So it wasn't the language for him, despite being a Gaeilgeoir. He did not encourage the language. So how would that make the Protestant minority in Ireland feel? Because they didn't satisfy the principal criterion for being Irish, according to Daniel O'Connell. So back to the 16th century. Forgive me for not being chronological. So Philip II wanted to rule us as well as Wales and England and his Spanish domains. Look at the Williamite Wars, 1688 and all that. So most of us Catholics were loyal to our true king, James of that name II. And yet some people regard them as proto-republicans, which is bonkers. It's utterly fallacious to claim these people were precursors of Republicans. The only connection between Jacobites and Republicans is that most of both groups are Catholics. We didn't have a parliamentary union with Great Britain in the 17th century, apart from a couple of years under Cromwell. So it wasn't about breaking the union, and it wasn't about breaking the connection with England. In fact, if we'd had a Catholic monarch in England and Ireland, our connection would have been all the greater. So the identification with one religious denomination as against the other seems to be the common thread through Jacobitism and republicanism.